So the first company I want to talk about is one that I just came across, relatively young company called Foyer, Foyer. And what Foyer does is essentially provide a 401k for homeownership. And so the general idea is that in the same way that we have these dedicated accounts and products that are for long-term savings for specific goals like retirement. Obviously, we have other ones for education and for healthcare expenses. Some of these accounts are tax advantaged in the US, some are not. But the principle is that there's sort of a design wrapped around these savings or investment products that are designed to try to drive people to a specific goal. And in this particular case, what Foyer is building is sort of the equivalent, a high yield savings account with some contribution matching and 2% contribution matching for saving for a down payment to buy a home. I have written a lot about this in my newsletter over the last year in particular. I wrote a piece, speaking of paternity leave, when I was out on paternity leave that was titled House or Birkin, and it was written in response to an article that I saw that drove me a little crazy that was about sort of an emerging trend among Gen Z consumers choosing to eschew homeownership, which they view as a inaccessible financial goal that's no longer available to their generation, in favor of saving up for luxury goods like Birkin bags. This disturbed me on a number of levels, but what was really interesting when I was sort of crunching the numbers and looking at it was I was reading the article and I was trying to sort of parse out, like, why are they doing this? What makes this like a better goal? And why are they feeling this way? And it was really interesting because the people who were interviewed for this article were talking in very similar terms to how I used to talk about home ownership, in terms of like trying to be disciplined. I'm trying to tuck some money away. It's hard, but I'm really excited about this goal. And they're building towards a pot of money that's pretty substantial, right? These luxury fashion items are not inexpensive. Birkin bags are, $20, $30, $40,000. And what struck me as interesting is that math is not that far off from the math you need to get to for home ownership. Now, of course, I completely understand, like, homes have gotten much more expensive. Cost of living for buying a home has outpaced inflation and wage growth. There's definitely been disruptions more recently in terms of interest rates going up and mortgages being unaffordable for a lot of the homes that people want to buy. So I completely sympathize with the challenges around home ownership. But the thing I was struck by in reading that article and writing my response to it was, it seems almost more like young consumers have a confidence problem around home ownership. They view it, whether they're right or wrong, as an inaccessible thing that's just not available to them. There's this like pessimism and hopelessness that I'm starting to see signs of. And what I've been thinking about is within the world of like prop tech and real estate and the mortgage market, and correct me if I'm wrong here, Simon, but like the last 30 years, it seems like we've exclusively focused on innovation that's for people who are ready to buy in the moment, right? So like, how do you find a house?
It's been pricing innovation and how quickly can I get you to convert, better.com. It's like, we'll front it all for you. You're going to buy, but like, we're just going to make that a little bit easier. Convert. But if you don't want to do it in the first place, if you don't think it's even possible, how do I hook you? How do I get you in? That makes a ton of sense. I saw a stat in the UK press just this morning, actually, that 8 out of 10 under 40s that live in major urban areas in the UK do not believe they will ever own a house. The under 40s, 8 out of 10 of them
that are currently
huge number. Yeah. So you got to think about the pessimism of a generation. I mean, the UK is turning Japanese. We are losing a generation of people. The amount of people who can actually afford a home is really, really rare, because we only really have one mega city, and it's kind of like New York. You got to own a house in New York, like in the suburbs. Like, that's hard to do, but the US is big enough that you can move to different areas. So that was kind of the hope thing. Completely makes sense to me, and a financial product completely makes sense to me. In the UK, we have something called the Help to Buy ISA. Now, an ISA is an interest-free savings account, so it's tax advantaged. And it is also contribution matched, I think, up to a certain amount by the UK government if you are a first-time buyer. So the government is actually trying to prop up the housing market with an interest-free savings account plus direct contribution from the IRS equivalent, from HMRC. So that's how much, and you could see that playing out in the US as well, which is, if I have a good job in a good city and I make it to six figures, how am I going to afford a $2.5 million home? Like it's just so far beyond reach in my mind. And the question becomes, should I? There's actually a sort of school of thought now that says, well, a house is an asset, but it's also a liability. As somebody who is currently having
line of thinking,
you know, like as somebody who just had their roof rebuilt and had all kinds of issues with it, you know, and then the boiler broke in the middle of winter when I just had a new baby. That's a liability. That takes up a lot of my headspace. It takes up a lot of my cash. And that's not a thing you have to worry about if you're renting, that you have this sort of consistent monthly outgoing and you can keep that cost low. So I think there's a generation of people that are looking at assets like luxury goods as being a more stable investment than housing, which is possibly not wrong if you consider where the future of asset prices might go. Can houses really continue to extend so far beyond earnings? Is that realistically for the next 20 years going to happen? Or are they going to actually stagnate a little bit? And would I be better off actually compounding all of my savings that was going into a house deposit into something else? Now, look, the reality is it's not binary. There's going to be some major shifts. But, you know, like people like to write off these young whippersnappers as being silly. And that was a great headline: buy luxury bags, not houses. But save, rent, like that's just a consequence of where we are. So can you convince somebody with a financial product? How are they doing that for you? How are they making this make sense? How are they solving the problem you talk about?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good question. You know, part of it, I think, is, and it's interesting to hear about how things work in the UK. In the US, we don't really have any good, like, on-ramps for home ownership, right? And so it's like, you know, we've done a lot of work to create a liquid mortgage market. We obviously have Fannie and Freddie. I mean, it's the most liquid housing market in the world, right? It's this like massive machine that's been built and subsidized by the US government. And yet it is fascinating to me that we don't have what you described in the UK. We don't have a US equivalent to that. And so it does remind me a lot of, and this is why I think the 401k analogy, even though it's not a tax advantaged account in quite the same way, this is why the 401k concept makes sense to me, which is with a 401k, like when I was 18, 16, you know, and I was working and I had my first job, I didn't think about retirement. I didn't understand what retirement was. I didn't know how much money I needed to save. I didn't understand the value of compounding returns from investing in a diversified portfolio of stocks over 40 years. Like none of that was interesting or like, you know, accessible knowledge to me, probably more for me than others because my parents were pretty focused on financial education when we were teenagers. But like it was a new idea, right? And so it was pretty cool when I started my first job that like a 401k was just built into the experience. Like you sign up, you set up your direct deposit, you pick out all your allocations. And I remember when I was 16, they were like, yeah, we have a 3%, luckily for the first job I had, we had a 3% match on 401k. I was like, well, that's interesting. I guess that's kind of cool. And this tells you like how awesome it is to be working while you're living at home and having no expenses. But I remember when I first set it up, I was like, why don't I send 15% of my paycheck to my 401k, which was like lunacy.